All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the next podcast in Max and Doyle Seeking Proper Education. We are finishing up our conversation about Plato's Republic. You can check out the first half, Plato's Republic, books 1 through 5, in which we had a guest whose name was JP. And I'll put a link to that video in the description. But tonight we're also going to be joined by Nathan Deacher, who actually, a couple of months ago, maybe 6 months ago, or I guess it's maybe closer to 9 months ago, he and I were attempting to do a podcast that for various reasons just kind of fell through. But he's a self-proclaimed Jewish leftist liberal cuck or something like that. What was it, Nathan?
Jewish leftist cuck, or Jewish, something to that effect.
Jewish leftist Platonist cuck. That was it.
Jewish leftist Platonist cuck. Yes, exactly.
So Max and I thought it would be more than appropriate to bring Nathan on board for this conversation. I personally can attest to his brilliance, and I'm really looking forward to exploring what has, in the course of the last couple of weeks, become one of my favorite books of philosophy from being one of my least favorite. So I'm excited to have you join us on this journey. So why don't I just let you, Nathan, give a little bit of introduction to who you are. This is the first time you and Max are meeting, so perhaps we can do a few short Q&A and then get right into our discussion.
Yeah. Well, tell me about yourself, Max.
Oh, I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. I went into Xavier with Doyle. I didn't meet him until senior year, but I went in for finance, and my collision with philosophy sent me to psychology, and then eventually I found the light with philosophy. And eventually that's how I found Doyle, and that brought me to this project. Other than that, I'm still living in Colorado, and I don't know. Is there any particular information you're looking for there?
Not really. I was in Colorado and like Denver and back in 2008. We went to the special seasonings. That was like honestly the only thing I really remember.
Don't remember the mountains.
And the mountain was pretty cool. I mean, we really did other stuff, but I have to have memory.
Awesome.
But yeah. So I'm originally from Philadelphia. And I went to Juniata, which is a small liberal arts college in the middle of Pennsylvania. There's a saying about Pennsylvania. It's Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Alabama in between. And I was at dead heart and center in the Alabama of it. And I actually met Doyle at a conference, Anchor in Memphis, and we hanged out in his hotel. It's another story which I might get into later. Some other time, but and then we had this idea about a podcast. As Doyle said, for a variety of reasons, it just didn't really work out. But I'm excited to see that Doyle did not give on the podcasting dream, and actually is done something much more successful than I would have definitely been able to do. And I'm honestly pretty humbled that you would invite me.
I think it's a pleasure to have a self-described Platonist on the podcast to describe this book, to say the least.
Okay, yeah. I mean, by the end, to make it intellectually diverse, you need a vegan Confucianist or something.
Well, great. So with that, I'd like to say a few words about the Republic. So this is the first time that I've actually read the Republic cover to cover in preparation for these two podcasts. And, the first couple of books, the first 5 even, were really difficult to get through, mostly because I was getting caught up in the arguments and what they were trying to say about justice and all of this. And it really wasn't until books 6 through 10 that the book really came together for me, and I realized that the conversation is less about justice than perhaps meets the eye, and there's a little bit of I don't want to say esoteric nature to it, because it is indeed about in the end about justice, but it's not about the precise definitions and the argumentations. I think there's a strong argument to be made that the narrative arc of the Republic paints the picture of one's development as a philosopher, and I just didn't see that. One of the things that I would always used to say about my Xavier education was how much I appreciated that we were only ever assigned readings from philosophers themselves. And that was great, but what we were never assigned to do was read whole books. We would go to the most important sections, and we would read them, like the Allegory of the Cave, for example, or the book 3 with Thrasymachus and sort of all of these things. But I was never actually assigned to read the book cover to cover. And as a result, I think I had a very exhausted understanding and view of Plato's Republic. And I don't think I, as a result, ever appreciated Plato as an author.
That reminds me of the Alan Bloom, who I think has one of the most popular translations. In his interpretive essay at the end of his translation, it begins with, "The Republic is the true apology of Socrates." And I think that, like you were saying, reading the text in an isolated way, especially focusing on something like the Allegory of the Cave, really misses that point, that the book is really about what the philosopher is more than its political overlay.
Yeah. And I would also add that I read the Fadio, I think a few months back recently. And it's actually probably one of my favorite dialogues, just because I just think it's so well written as a drama. I don't think you guys have gotten into it, I don't believe, but it's just the potency of the drama and the characters and the context, and like they simply just reduce it to like a set of arguments, like maybe an analytic philosopher would do, is just totally missing the point, And I was rereading the Republic for this podcast, and I was just struck about like the layers of the argument and just the subtlety and the nuance. And you kind of realize that, this is ultimately a work of politics and ethics, but you realize there's so much more going on. And I kind of feel like a lot of, I was seeing a meme that said, what your favorite Platonic dialogue says about you. And if you choose Republic, your favorite song is Smells Like Teen Spirit, and your favorite book is Harry Potter or something. It's like people, when people say like, oh, I read the Republic or something, it's like this really cliche thing. Like you might have just read the Allegory of the Cave, you're like, wow, Plato's amazing. And I think, unfortunately, that's how most people understand Plato. They just understand him from these just excerpts. But I think once you actually really read the dialogue and understand how the argument and the dialectic unfold, you are really able to sort of comprehend Plato's genius, I think.
Indeed. I was recently listening to a podcast that I don't remember who it was by, about Nietzsche, and the podcaster made the argument that understanding Nietzsche apart from his particular writing style, as if to reduce him to like a set of premises and conclusions and arguments and things like that, can't actually be done, right? And I think that the same can be said of Plato, that there isn't Plato apart from the dialogues in which he writes, because there's just so much richness that's communicated in the text and so many different levels of analysis that to reduce anything to a set of arguments and to remove the experience, both emotional, philosophical, spiritual even, of reading the dialogue and participating in the conversation with the interlocutors, really does a disservice to the thinker. And I think that's why, I stand having definitely learned something about Plato, and I think it's in some sense reinvigorating my love of Western philosophy, right? Given that, Plato more or less started it all, at least in the fashion that we have inherited through the great books.
Can I ask a question? It might be a sharp turn, but while we're at this broad overview level of the text, you said in the beginning that it might not necessarily be an esoteric text. and I was reading it, and while I was reading it, I was reading it as an esoteric text. So I was wondering if you guys thought that there was a lot of esotericism going on um, inside of Plato's arguments, and or why you might have said that it wasn't necessarily esoteric.
Well, I avoided the word esoteric particularly for the reason that, well,
Can I add to that, Doyle?
sure.
Okay, so is it an esoteric text? I would say hell yes. You have to remember that Plato, he left Athens when he was 30, I believe, after the death of Socrates, and he traveled around the Mediterranean. It's believed that he spent some time in Egypt. What he exactly learned is a little unclear, but I wouldn't be surprising if he picked up a lot of Egyptian thought from there. But we do know, and where he clearly showed the writing on his hand was when he spent time in South Italy with the Pythagoreans. And the Pythagoreans are extremely interesting and a religious philosophical sect that you probably should dedicate an entire episode to. And they explicitly believed that their teachings weren't like that there were different levels to the teachings that they were in that school. And so, and in fact, they guarded these sort of mystical, these esoteric secrets, especially because the Pythagoreans were kind of seen as like a fringe, a religious sect. They were often threatening to a lot of Greek city-states around the Mediterranean. So, and I think I think there's several like uses of like numbers, like the Nuptial number, for instance, that like Plato uses to determine like I forget which context, I think generation or something. And scholars have determined that actually has Pythagorean, it's part of Pythagorean number symbolism. So I think there's plenty of esotericism, and I think Plato is primarily a very esoteric thinker. He thinks in terms of hierarchy, knowledge being less closer or far away from sort of intelligible principles. So I think he thinks in a very very much in like a pyramid. So yeah, I think it is an esoteric text.
I think I'm also getting that from comparing it to his other dialogues. The other dialogues are very short, very to the point. Just like the Symposium that we read, the Apology is relatively short, and the Republic is unbelievably long. And I think at least intuitively, I was going into it as he's going on so much because he's trying to show those who are reading closely something that wouldn't be shown in a short dialogue.
Right. I think a lot of it is Pythagoreanism and other sort of mystical beliefs. I think he sort of held close to his heart and probably his disciples. And there's an entire literature, it's called the Tübingen School, I think, which argues, because there was testimony that said that Plato had an unwritten doctrine, and specifically because if you read Pythagoras, for instance, he's a little suspicious of writing down his doctrines. It's like definitive texts or textbooks, but he would give lectures to his students and in an oral format. And there's been a team, a sort of school of scholarship that believes that this unwritten doctrine is real, that it actually is sort of like the next level to understanding Plato. And you actually can find scattered references in the dialogues that students studying at the academy would have picked up on. But we, as 21st century readers, have to kind of speculate and guess.
That's extremely interesting.
Well, I was just going to turn the question around on you, Max. To what in the dialogue do you think that you found, or when with your approach to the text as esotericism, did you find anything interesting or any interpretations that were particularly helpful?
In all honesty, there was nothing unifying by the end of the book in my mind. And maybe that just was because of time constraints and the inability to read as closely as I would have wanted to. But I think this especially came out in the early books with the formation of the city. It's like if you were actually going to sit down and formulate a city, this wouldn't seem like the way you would do it. And in those sections, I got the intuition that what Plato's talking about isn't necessarily the formation of the just city per se. He's trying to show us facets of human nature and of orientation towards certain things.
Indeed, it seemed a lot more psychological, sort of in the same way that the genealogy of morality is a psychological explanation of how we ended up with moral values. This kind of seemed to be a psychological explanation for how we ended up with cities.
Yeah, precisely. And I would say that I read the Republic more of like as more of a mirror than something that's providing knowledge. And you actually see this in the allegory of the cave too, where he talks about how education is not like putting sight into blind eyes, but is the turning of the whole soul towards something. And I am maybe that's one esoteric frame to put on the text, that the journey through the text is an attempt to turn souls towards something, which I think perhaps is the form of the good and what being a philosopher consists in.
Yeah. And I also, when you read, him talking about the idea of the good and how it is the sun that illuminates all being and gives it its both being, its existence, and its intelligence, it's a really beautiful simile. I think it's in book 6, I believe.
Yeah.
And I think and I always have wondered, like, it sounds very similar to like a genuine, I guess, spiritual or religious experience. And I do wonder, what might have provoked that. We know there was, the cult of Ulysses. I probably didn't read it wrong. The cult of the Elysian Mysteries. Yes. Where where people were where it was described as kind of like this dying before you have died, and was sort of this mystical initiation rite. I wonder if it might have been from there, or might have.
I think we lost Nathan.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, temporarily cut out, but
okay.
Continue.
Okay. But no, I was just saying that I think that the description, the simile of the good, sounds like a first-hand account. It doesn't sound like Plato's just sort of engaging in the imaginative speculation. It sounds like he is genuinely describing him having what we would call, consider the, seeing the form of the good.
I totally agree with you, and I think that that's what characterizes the second half of the book versus the first half of the book. The first half of the book is very much, I think it serves sort of that interpretive structure that I was laying out of how it is that one becomes a philosopher starting at the surface level and then through various phases comes to actually experience the truth, right? And it's only at that point in book 6 with the simile of the sun, actually, that lying in all of its forms gets completely taken away. And in sort of, at least in my interpretation, signifies a marked shift in somebody's understanding, right? Whereas before, lies were used to more or less make truths convenient for the masses so that you could manipulate them. And it's like this exterior focus on the utility of philosophy that an uninitiated philosopher might have. But once you've actually gone through the descent from surface level to sophistry to getting lost in the details to discovering the truth, everything becomes different, and you can no longer rely on the same tactics that you used in the previous in your previous modes as a philosopher.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also think it's interesting because, it's hard. I think there are a lot of debates about whether the sort of the just city, which Plato describes in the first 5 books of the Republic, is meant to be taken as like an actual blueprint, or whether it's a satire, or whether it's a sort of a generic thought experiment. And I think there's, arguments to be made about all three of those options. But I do think I think he is definitely saying one clear, I guess we could call it an ethical / political statement, which is the famous quote. And I had the Stevenson notations are 473 onward. It's the famous quote: "Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world, and have the spirit and power of philosophy and political greatness and wisdom, meet in one, these commoner natures that pursue either to the exclusion of the other are compelled to stand aside. Cities will never have rest from their evils, no, nor the human race, as I believe. And then only will our state have the possibility of life and behold the light of day." And I think that is, if there's one thing that I think Plato wants to communicate, is that that philosophy is a vocation of a higher way of life.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's the organization of the soul of the human being in a way that, by beholding the form of the good and the soul ordering itself in accordance with that, and that ideally the polis needs to be the same inner constitution in accordance with the good needs to be applied to the entire polis. But I also think, if you read the text carefully, especially when he describes the 5 different regimes, I think he's ultimately fairly cynical about that actually coming about. I think in this sense, I think the Kalopolis is the first utopia. And utopia in Greek literally means no place. It's meant to be a sort of an impractical impossibility. And I think what Plato is telling us is the world, we might never be able to have, the absolutely just state, but we can still try to order our policies, and more importantly, our souls, because ultimately I think Plato, at the end of the day, was a political realist, even if he had idealistic aspirations. We have to order our souls for a kind of philosophical salvation.
Right. No, I mean, I think the word salvation there is more than fitting. I think that there is a very, just look at the allegory of the cave. There's a messianic quality to not only what philosophy does for the philosopher, but what the philosopher can do for the rest of society. I remember when I first encountered the allegory of the cave, I was actually in high school, I was particularly religious in high school. I still am now, but and I remember reading the allegory of the cave and kind of breaking down into tears because I had, glimpsed at what Justin Martyr called God's revelation to the pagans, right? There's that, and of course, in my youth, I would basically just say that Plato was just talking about Jesus and he didn't know it. And now I would probably backtrack on that and be a little more nuanced in my character of thought, but really that, there's something at stake here. And that doing philosophy, learning how to enter into these conversations, learning how to uncover things, right? I mean, that's what the Greek word for truth means, aletheia, right? It's the unveiling of something, that it actually does something for you. And it doesn't necessarily make your life easier, right? Because the philosopher doesn't have a great time of it. He ends up getting killed in exchange for what he's offering people. But for some reason, and ultimately I think it's because Plato has an immortality of the soul and mind, as becomes very evident in Book 10, that the trivialities and the sufferings of this life, provided that they're, I don't want to say channeled in the proper way, but provided that they are done with the right intentions, have the ability to return you to where you should always have been, contemplating the eternal forms.
Right. Yeah, and I think we'll get to the mythover at some point now, but I think the mythover is definitely a very good mythos, the summarized logos.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of, in the same way, I think how mythos was used in the symposium, for instance, to sort of communicate certain truths, but not necessarily through the dialect. The mythos is a slightly inferior form of communicating certain metaphysical truths, but it's still a valid one for Plato, albeit one that ultimately is sort of auxiliary to a logos.
Well, and what's interesting is that he chooses to cap the dialogue with the myth.
Right.
He does the same thing in the Phaedo, right? Just like the dialogue you were talking about earlier.
Right.
And you almost get the sense that the symposium should have ended with the myth too, and yet Alcibiades comes in and the myth gets cut short by somebody's drunkenness, right?
Right. Well, one theory I have about that is that basically Alcibiades' speech is like the satire play at the end of like a tragic trilogy. Like,
yeah.
Did you guys go over that theory?
We did not, but that totally makes sense to my mind. And we just read tragedy, right? And the whole idea is that you have to rehabilitate with comedy at the end.
Right. This to make sure people don't take it, the cheer people's moods up, and also the kind of make sure that you're not taking it too seriously. So the satire play would kind of be a summation, the theme of the tragedy, but in a much more sort of Burlesque way. I think the only surviving tragedy play is like one with like Ulysses and the Cyclops, and it starts with this sort of like highfalutin philosophizing, but eventually involves like, I think, getting the Cyclops drunk and then trying to rape it. I mean, really crude and awful stuff. But like, I think the whole idea was to kind of lighten the mood and make sure that the somber themes of the trilogy, were taken with a little jest.
Indeed. So why is it that the Republic, particularly, is allowed to end in this sort of somber, in a sense, hopeful, tragic way?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, my own theory is that this dialogue, I mean, if you read the first book of the Republic, it reads like a very early Socratic dialogue where Socrates poses a question, what is justice? He sort of deflates the other definitions that are being given by other folks. And the whole thing ends in aporia, or just confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know what piety is. What were we going to say, Max?
I was going to say, don't you think that it's also, given the teachings of the first 9 books, it's sort of an offer to the reader of a sense of ultimate autonomy over one's life?
Right.
The myth is a myth that gives you the sense that you can pursue you can choose the life that you live prior to living it. And so I feel like that it ends in myth because Plato's trying to convey the teachings of the first 9 books to the individual reading it. He's giving them the option to choose a life in which their soul is oriented towards something, as if they were before they were born.
Right. But I also think the important thing is that you turn to the philosophic life not out of necessity. And there's the Greek word anake. It refers to cosmic necessity, but I also think Plato is thinking about political necessity. He talks about the cyclical rise and fall of different regimes, for instance, from aristocracy to democracy to oligarchy to democracy to tyranny, which tyranny is the worst form of government. So that is sort of the cyclical spindle necessity kind of operating. And we're often like thrown to one climate opinion to another, or we just sort of mindlessly kind of drift with the geopolitical cycles at the time. Although I think Plato also means this in a cosmic sense. But for him, the philosopher isn't just moved to pursue the philosophical, convenience or fashion. He does it because he has pursued a vision. He has seen a vision of the good. He orients his life around it, and he won't be affected by the ceaseless churning of the wheel of fortune.
Hey, can you speak a little bit more about this? Because as I was reading, I thought, without trying to be too political, it did seem to me that the description of democracy breaking down into tyranny was eerily similar to at least the society that we are living in currently.
Andrew Sullivan makes this point.
And it was,
yeah,
it
Andrew
was actually, it was
wrote a
pretty eerie to me. But I want to kind of phrase that as a question. What is, you know, besides kind of taking a stoic step back, what is the mission of the philosopher in the midst of the breakdown of one form of government to a worse form of government? And, you know, frankly, what should we be doing with our lives, provided that we actually become philosophers and pursue that? I mean, what do we do when we can literally see what Plato said was going to happen to a democracy happening around us?
Yeah. Could I get a stab at that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify that when we talk about the current political moment, I mean, obviously, you know, with the current administration and things of that nature, I think, but I also think we have to remember that there's been a drift towards autocracy across the world, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's been Xi Jinping, you know, determining term limits. I think we're seeing a drift towards tyranny across the world. I think America is just one instance of it. So, I mean, let's try to have like a more global perspective, you know. But yeah, I mean, I've thought about this as well, and I just give a little backstory. You know, I read The Republic also in like Doyle in high school, and I was also just struck with the almost like power of it. You know, like, you know, some people describe, you know, when they read the Communist Manifesto and like instantly then and there made them lifelong Marxists or something. For me, when I read The Republic, I became a lifelong Platonist and towards philosophy in general. I had the sense that philosophy was a mission. You know, I need to orient myself towards the life of the philosopher, you know, and have this, I even say religious or spiritual nature to this, a vocation, a calling, vocation and from what comes from the Latin, which means calling. You're being called by something, some higher power, whether it's God or nature or what have it. And then, so I majored in philosophy, and I certainly got a lot from it. You know, I don't regret taking it. Then you see what philosophy is, how it is perceived, you know, not just in the general public, but also in academia, how it just becomes this dry, lifeless subject that loses all of the, you know, spiritual, even existential significance that it had in antiquity, you know. And I really grappled with that. And now I'm in a job right now, which ostensibly doesn't really have anything to do with philosophy. You know, it's, you know, working for, you know, an NGO with like people with special needs. But then I kind of remind myself that like the philosophic life, I mean, ideally you would want, you know, philosophers in high positions of power. But like, I think we in our own lives can say, you know, I might be even sort of crossing with the sort of Christian idea of vocation. You see maybe in like a person like Luther, for instance. But like maybe we should try to pursue this calling of philosophy, whatever our stations in life are. Maybe if, you know, if Plato were here around and say like, it's okay, maybe if you don't have, you know, political power at this point, but you know what, you and your station of life can still try to, you know, improve the polis, as it were, you know, through your actions here and now. You know, you don't have to be a king or a prince or something to, you know, to help heal the collective soul of the world.
Yeah, I think that was.
I don't want to sound like
that was beautiful.
TMX.
Yeah, that was beautifully put, and I think it brought me back to what you were saying about the cyclic nature in Plato of things, and to hit on your question, Doyle. I don't think Plato's. It's not a matter of what you do; it's a matter of your orientation. And the orientation towards something admits of any political climate. If you're oriented towards the good, it wouldn't matter if you were in a tyranny or a democracy or whatever else it would be. It's the orientation of the soul that matters, because that would allow for infinitely new particulars to be dealt with given that orientation.
Great.
I struggle to think, though, that there's not some particular call to action there in the degeneration of one form. And maybe it is simply limited to kind of set your own house in order, orient your own self towards the good. But I think in the context of the ending of the allegory of the cave, where the philosopher goes back in to rescue those that are down there, that there is something about that in the context then later of the degeneration of the various regimes, that there would be some sort of similar call to action of descending into the cave in order to bring people out. And clearly, I don't know that. I don't know necessarily going around talking about the glories of philosophy and trying to teach people about it is how you do it. It would seem that there's something different there, and it would just seem that there's something that would require you to take some kind of stand for the good.
Well, don't the Plato's or the characters themselves in the dialogue wrestle with this question when I forget if it's Glaucon or Adeimantus says, why would you make the philosophers go back down into the cave? They're happy looking at the form of the good. In other words, there's sort of an unanswered question of whether the philosopher should go back down to the cave or be forced to.
Yeah, well, I found that passage particularly interesting, and I'm not trying to pivot here, but if the philosophers are forced to rule, right, and they have to go back down into the cave to, in some sense, re-solidify their training, it would seem that fundamental principle from which we derived the definition of justice, right, the one person, one job principle, it's almost like philosophy grants you the ability to transcend that rule because it makes you multifaceted. Would you agree?
I think so. I mean, to be fair, like I do feel, I mean, as much as I love Plato, I think at least sometimes I think he does overestimate the abilities of philosophers. I mean, at the end of the day, while I think the vocation of philosophy is superhuman, I think the people who practice it, are, very human, I mean, Plato tried to educate, the tyrant of, Syracuse, I believe, several times. It was a catastrophe, and I think that was an example where Plato wanted to sort of implement his ideas in the world. He said, maybe I can try to philosophically educate, people who are in power. I can make one of the most wretched tyrannies in, Syracuse, change his ways and institute, a just state. But it failed. The circumstances out of his control. So I think from that, I think Plato realized that, like, the vocation of philosophy is still valid, but it has to be somewhat more realistic about human nature. The Republic is a beautiful book, but I don't think it necessarily captures all the complexities of human psychology in a way that I think it should.
I completely agree. And I mean, do you think that failure to capture human psychology is deliberate by Plato?
I think he's just captured in the enthusiasm of the idea of the good. I mean, I think whenever you're in some sort of enthusiasm or zeal, whether it's about religion or a political ideology or your lover or whatever it is, when you genuinely have a passionate eros towards something, sometimes you're a little naive. I mean, we all know that feeling, at some point in life where we had a deep, almost erotic fueled, I use erotic in like the original Greek sense, erotic urge towards some higher ideal. And sometimes we lose sight of, of the complexities of the world.
Doyle, do you think that your questions or is there something still nagging you here?
No, I don't know that something is still nagging me. I'm trying to. The present conversation is in some sense giving me a little bit of a sense of despair after having gotten to the end of the book, because I really felt that it was calling me to something that was not only achievable and doable, but there was like a lot of practicality there. And maybe that's in some sense, Nathan, what you're talking about in terms of a naivete, right? I mean, I just in some sense read this book cover to cover for the first time and am sort of wrapped by what I perceive to be its greatness, and I want to see more than perhaps there is.
Right. But Doyle, I would tell you that I felt that exact same despair when that initial enthusiasm wore off and that spiritual high cratered. But I will tell you that ultimately, at the end of the day, resurfaced, because I ultimately felt that calling never left me. The calling towards a higher life and a higher purpose never really have left me. I think it's always sort of been in my conscious or unconscious mind. And I think if you want an example, I mean, of a person who, even though he lived, millennia after Plato, it might not necessarily have identified as part of this tradition, but I think it's sort of fitting considering today is the 50th anniversary of his assassination, was a person like Dr. King, a person, who oriented himself towards the idea of the good. And in his speeches, he talked about how he felt he was doing God's will, how that orientation towards this moral arc of the universe was the guiding principle, in his life. And there's a great quote I just found online, which he was talking about his time in Montgomery. And quote, Bull Connor next to me would say, turn the fire hoses on. And as I said to you the other night, Bull Connor didn't know history. He knew about a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics we all knew. And that was the fact that there was a certain kind of fire that no water could put out. And I think that in the midst of all the trials and tribulations that he went through, and some of his many flaws as a human being, as we were talking about, how, not every human being, and how human psychology is very murky and complicated. He was still motivated by that singular vision of the good. I think, if Plato got to meet Dr. King, I think he would say that this man has had a glimpse of the good.
Yeah. And additionally, I think once you take on board the fundamental nature of a human life is creative, there's no set path, then the call to action remains, but the call to action would remain for any individual life. So whatever going down into the cave might mean for an individual, you would have to discern that for yourself after orienting your soul to the good. So I think the call to action remains, but it's both oriented towards a form, which is infinitely encompassing, but it's also infinitely particular inside of an individual whom is oriented towards it.
And I think it's also just a monumentous task in both of those things, right? First, to orient oneself towards the good, and then to figure out what you're supposed to do about it afterwards. I think, in particular, I could use perhaps a little just more contemplation in a sort of Platonic sense in my own life.
Gloria.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very much a person that's in love with ideas. But I think to kind of use Nietzsche's turn of phrase, I think more often I am possessed by ideas than do I possess ideas.
Isn't it also in Plato that the good is above ideas?
It is.
So you could get lost in ideas and love them, but that there's something that transcends even the most profound ideas.
Indeed. And I think that's precisely the theme of book 5. Right, Glaucon and Adiamentus backtrack because Thrasymachus is whispering something, and they end up going on this kind of pretty much useless tangent, which he actually says some really cool and progressive things about women, which we didn't ever talk about, but pretty remarkable stuff coming from 2,600 years ago. Man, those people were backwards. Well, but at the same time, they do that, right? They actually get lost in the ideas and they miss the boat, but that's just part of their development and education as philosophers.
And also, I think I didn't fully appreciate, until I sort of studied the Republic further, was when I heard, this sort of simplification of Plato, which is thought is superior to sense perception. And what I didn't realize is in the divided line, Plato makes the distinction between two types of thinking. Dionia, which we kind of call discursive thinking that we kind of do every day. And then noesis, which is kind of like intuitive grasp of the intelligible world, which is the basis of thinking, and that how often we confuse, and so often sometimes we confuse like the chatter in our head with like the actual contemplation of forms. And Plato's actually saying that noesis is the initial condition that sets the possibility of lower discursive thought, but we can't identify discursive thinking with the initial higher reasoning that takes place in the upper part of the soul, upper faculty of the soul. And I think that's a distinction which I don't think a lot of people in Plato, readers of Plato, understand. And there's an interesting book I read, Roger Penrose, The Emperor's New Mind. He makes a similar argument that, and I don't know how you would feel about this, Doyle, which is that AI algorithms are imitating discursive thinking, neural networks and things like that, but it's not able to replicate this intuitive grasp of mathematics, which Penrose, kind of using Gödel's last theorem, a very complicated, very partial grasp of, kind of shows that computers, at least how computers are currently made and the physics currently used. I mean, he's open to the idea that the brain might be a kind of quantum computer, but he ultimately thinks that kind of thinking cannot be replicated by at least machines currently, although possibly machines in the future.
Well, this is interesting. I think more or less, correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, what you're saying is that there's a certain capacity within the intellect that in some sense grasps that things are way more complicated than it could ever speak into existence, right, through argument or discursive thinking. Yeah. And yet there's a knowledge that it exists, right? There's a certain almost kind of Socratic humility about the nature of the universe. And I think that's probably, or at least that's reflected seemingly in the fact that the Republic ends with a myth, right? A myth which has precisely in its genre not premise conclusion, but a story about a person who did something, right? Which is to say something that's way more complicated than premise conclusion, which is what we get for the first 9 books.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think people confuse the higher level thinking with that lower level thinking, or at least we as moderns conflate the two, while for Platonists, they were 2 separate faculties that were related but separate.
Do you think that the higher level thinking, that thinking of the intellect, is communicable through language?
That's a good question. I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation suggests that we at least in part can communicate it, but do I think it can fully adequately sort of express that kind of knowledge? Not really. I mean, yeah, I mean, like even when people like talk about, religious or mystical experiences, they have to metaphoric language is necessary because they don't really know how to verbalize and communicate that. Language is a tricky thing, and I think hell, I mean, even I'm just thinking about even when it comes to our sense, when we empirically sense things, there are plenty of smells and sights that we feel, we sense in the world, we have sensations of, but we often struggle to find the right word. So I think discursive thinking always has its limitations, just the way that sense perception has limitations.
Well, I was just sort of thinking when I was reading the dialogue that there was this sense in which the human mind could attain an understanding through the intellect in which it could never convey through a medium, and that would be the true ascent to the form. But once you've seen the true form of something, it's impossible to ever communicate that back to someone without bringing them up and showing it to them, from the cave. In other words, there's a faculty of the human mind which is incommunicable, but which Plato is trying to show us that it exists in the soul of each.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah, And I also think that it's the capability. I mean, I also think it's like the capability, because you think about like, I probably will do a really horrible job, like actually summarizing Penrose's arguments. I don't bother. But one thing they kind of points out in Gödel's last theorem. Gödel was a famous 20th century logician, and he basically argued that within any kind of formal system, he's really kind of thinking of like mathematics, like axiomatic set theory, for instance. And I think Doyle actually knows a little bit more about this than I do. There's certain truths about that system that are true, or just have to be assumed to be true, but can never actually be proved within that system. Like I think, so for instance, like the favorite theory of set theory, for instance, like the axiom of choice, like it's the ability to actually self-reflect on those axioms and actually determine truth value of them. So that's
you cannot prove the axiom of choice to be either true or false.
Yes, and that's something. I mean, I might be completely butchering this because my knowledge of set theory is not as strong as it should be. Is that cannot be, at least according to Gödel, that cannot be proven within the formal system, and it is a truth that exists outside of the formal system but can't be proven within it. And so Gödel argued that all attempts of like baroque, formal logical systems will always exclude certain truths, And to me, Gödel himself was, a Platonist. And I think for him, he had like a quote like, either the human brain will never be capable of mathematics, or human mathematics are not contained to the brain. I think he would argue the latter. In fact, that we have a certain faculty in our intellect that allows us to access certain truths, but the human brain but we will never fully be able to sort of adequately translate those higher order concepts that we've discovered into a communicable medium.
Right. It's like the only way in which we do find some way of doing it is in the context of story, which is particularly associated with action, right, in the world.
Right.
I'm thinking particularly about, just beautiful works of literature that clearly capture something of that truly intellectual reflection or contemplation, that when they become instantiated in the form of a story, whether it's a Shakespeare play or whatever, it's precisely to get us to act in a certain way, and not to compel us to act into a certain way, but to show that this is the reflection that I have done, and this leads me to act in such a way, or it leads a character to act in such a way, and then you can reflect on the nature of that character and whether or not they made the right choice, which I think is interesting because ultimately, because we are in and of the world, there's particularly that contemplation of the forms has to result in something, and not from like a utilitarian sense, but you have to do something with it. Clearly, you can't sit in your study and contemplate the forms all day, right? You still have to get up in the morning, and you have to get dressed and go to work and interact with your family and your friends and all of these other things. Right? That reflection becomes embedded within a particular framework of a person's life, and he or she has to act on the basis of those reflections. And I think that that's probably a more accurate explanation of where morality comes from. I really don't think that you can divorce any of these things that we're talking about, contemplation of the forms or truth or any of these things. They ultimately come back to a lesson of what should I do tomorrow morning when I wake up, or tonight before I go to bed.
I kind of agree with that because, and this is, I think I might be even venturing to the realm of Neoplatonism, in which the world soul is a hypostasis of a triad of structures that order the cosmos. But you think about like all these forms, like beauty and justice and good, like these are eternal ideas, but they only really have relevance and value if they're being actualized in the real world. Whitehead, who's also a disciple, he kind of has a reform Platonism of sorts. It's not exactly like Platonism with a capital P, but he talks about how there's certain eternal objects, which I guess are his equivalent of Platonic forms, that set the initial occasions of a panpsychist universe. Like basically, they're the eternal values which all the little budding panpsychist creatures that inhabit the cosmos are able to apprehend and use that to actualize themselves, in the cosmos. So beauty is only relevant insofar as it's relevant to the feeling conscious creatures in the cosmos. And I just think, there's all these debates about, what the nature, how does consciousness fit into a physical cosmos? And I think we might want to frame the question a little bit differently. I think the only way that our universe has any value is the fact there are observers, be it human beings or other beings possibly in the cosmos, they're able to apprehend the abstract values of beauty and justice and give it value. Like, I think consciousness is an irreducible structure to our phenomenal world, just in the way the Platonic forms are.
Nathan, a little while ago, I would have been pretty contemptuous of your view, having just read Meillassoux and having you describe correlationism in such a wonderful and elegant way. But ultimately, I've come to see that I think that you're right. And I think that any attempt to, overly simplify something like saying, oh, but the universe existed 13.7 billion years ago before the advent of consciousness, and thus it exists outside and a part of any observer or personality or whatever it is that we are that experience the phenomena of the universe. I think that that's precisely why there's always there must be that moral weight to everything that goes on, and to all of these thoughts, these reflections, contemplations. It has to make you do something, or else you stop being that thing that experiences or is given the phenomena of the universe.
Right.
That's precisely what we are as conscious beings.
Right. And I also think, if my hypothesis is correct, it's not necessarily that conscious beings had to exist, 13 billion years ago when the Big Bang started. It's just that consciousness in some form, it doesn't have to be us, or it can be a very kind of primitive proto-consciousness, an electron, existed, has always existed. And if you read accounts of what the world soul does, in both Platonism and also Stoicism, it's constantly sustaining the world. I think in the Timaeus it says the world soul is the wet nurse of the cosmos, constantly sustaining it through apprehending itself.
Isn't there, in an opposite sense, a reductionist account in which the forms are something that only a conscious, intelligent being can find in their mind, but have no relationship to the actual, not no relationship, but that the forms are not, the forms don't exist in the world, but only in mind? And do you think
like a kind of nominalism?
I think it's more of a question about correspondence, a correspondence theory of truth.
Right. Yeah, into definitions of truth are going to be tricky.
I guess I'm wondering whether, at least for Plato, whether the forms exist in reality, or whether they're an abstraction from reality that only a conscious mind could apprehend through the intellect.
I think he seems to think that they do have clear, authentic existence. I think Yeah, I mean, that's how I would frame the question. I mean, I think for him they exist. Whether our conception, I think you could argue maybe our conceptions of the forms are always going to be inadequate because they're only partial grasp at this sort of eternal truth sort of existing, in the knowledge realm or the intellectual realm. But I think the forms themselves exist. Maybe human conceptions of them are going to be somewhat flawed, but that's how Plato would answer that question.
Don't they only exist in the particulars, though?
No, I think that's more Aristotle.
That's more okay.
Yeah.
Because I was just wondering that as you guys were speaking in terms of the relationship between consciousness and the forms.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, this is my reading of Platonism, which is definitely influenced by Neoplatonism, which I also think is kind of a stupid word because I think they didn't consider themselves to be Neo-Platonists. They were just Platonists. But yeah, I think this idea that the soul or consciousness is a fundamental role in the ordering of the cosmos is a reading that's definitely found in the dialogues and is definitely believed by a majority of people who hold who call themselves Platonists.
So what then for a Platonist would be the relationship between consciousness and the forms?
That's a good question.
Yeah, no, this is a good question because it's precisely like I remember when I learned the divided line. My professor, drew the divided line up on the board and then asked the class, "Where's the human being?" And I just remember being struck by that after having heard a great account of this is how the universe is. Suddenly, we're presented with thinking about ourselves who find existence in both realms, right? Because we have a body in the images and in the material things, and yet we also have a soul or a mind or whatever you want to call it that dwells in this realm up and above, right? And at least for Plato, or at least in the context of the myth at the end of the story, the idea is that the body is something of a corruption. I mean, correct me if you have a different interpretation, but something of a corruption of the soul and a mismanagement of the passions, right? Professor once said, it's more or less the soul is floating around up there contemplating the forms, and it looks down into the material world and it sees something shiny. And it wants it, and at that moment is the birth of that soul as a human or as an animal, depending on what their desire was for. And then through successive reincarnations and hopefully learning something, you end up choosing the life of just the eternal contemplation of the forms, and that philosophy then is the preparation for death. And yet it still leaves you in this sort of odd position of one, how do you explain that? And two, what's to be done about that, right? I mean, I think it's so contrary to at least the Christian notions of what an eternal life would be, which involves a resurrection of the body, right, and a life of the world to come, as opposed to it seems like it's a more robust, at least understanding of humanity, right? There seems to be an intellectualism that pervades in Plato.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think Platonism is not body friendly. It's very body shaming, even before body shaming was a thing. But yeah, I mean, there's a quote. I love this quote. Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist, I think, the 3rd century, I believe. He was his biography, his disciple Porphyry's first line was, Plotinus was ashamed of his body, and then it goes on to say that a disciple was trying to sketch an image of him for a bust, and then Plotinus noticed that was happening and said, "Why would you make why would you make an inferior copy of my body, which is an inferior copy of my soul, which is an inferior copy of the intelligible realm?" I mean, so I think there is Platonists generally have a low regard of the world of becoming, which I think is a little unfortunate, because I don't think it necessarily has to be. I generally think that when Plato was writing this sort of body-aching stuff, he just had indigestion or something. That's my own headcanon.
Well, isn't it also just with the formation of the city that being constrained to a body, you're constrained to necessity?
I think part of that, yeah, but at the same time, you live in a city. So I think, so this sense, I think Plato would agree with Aristotle saying that man is a political animal. They also say we're also, an incarnated soul. I think he would say we're both and, political animals and incarnated souls, incarnated bodies.
So Plato was certainly not a materialist.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. I mean, I think you can say that Platonism is specifically assigned as being antithesis to I guess materialism, nominalism, relativism. It's anti all those things, first, and then it kind of forms its.
Well, what's interesting is how conscious it would seem Plato is of the problem, though, of the independent existence of the forms. Right? I haven't read the dialogue, but there's a dialogue in which a young Socrates makes an argument for the forms, and it ends with Socrates more or less being defeated, because if there's a world of the forms, then there has to be a form of the world of the forms, and if that exists, then there's a form of the world of the forms, and ad infinitum.
I actually solved that problem in a presentation, a paper I gave at a liberal arts symposium.
Tell me about it, Nathan.
Oh, I'll have to bring it up, but basically my argument was that even and I think there's actually some strong textual arguments for this in Parmenides and also some other dialogues I didn't add, but basically the forms in them, like just as the forms value unity over multiplicity, so within the sort of you can think of the forms as a kind of a hierarchy, and that the simple and that more abstract forms or sort of simple, more particular forms fall under the branch of more universal forms, or simplify the more universal forms until you get to the form of the good or the one. Like a branching off tree.
I mean, that would seem to be kind of sort of Aristotelian, right? Because at least of things that exist in the material world, there are 4 of them, right? 4 forms of them.
I haven't studied Aristotelian metaphysics as probably as well as you have, but maybe. I mean, there's also, I think, something in the unwritten doctrines, I think, that apparently is kind of like Plato's meta theory of forms, which kind of complements the theory sketches on the dialogues. But I haven't done enough reading on that. But I mean, it's 10:48 here, and I don't know how long my brain can do concept metaphysics.
Indeed. Well, I do sense a little bit of, at least in my own self, a bit of aphoria, right? Some confusion now, and I don't know what to do going forward. So, Nathan, I don't know if you know this, but Max and I generally try to end each podcast with a short discussion about how we're going to try to live our lives differently on the basis of what we learned from the text. And I think our conversation was stimulating and went off in very many healthy directions, but it might be a good place to kind of end with sort of a reflection on, particularly for Max and I, right? We've got this whole program of reading ahead of us, through Aristotle next and on to, some great Roman authors, Lucretius, Virgil, Marcus Aurelius, before, kind of going into a more medieval period. What do you think, Max? Where do we stand? What do we gain, and where do we stand to go from here?
In terms of Life lessons?
Yeah, life lessons.
I've been struggling with this, and the word that keeps arising in my head is orientation from the Republic. And my question is sort of along the lines of I think it might be book 5 or book 4, when Glaucon asks whether or not the Republic is possible, and Socrates sort of shirks this question. But I'm wondering if the fully oriented soul is possible, and whether or not in my life it would be possible to orient my soul in such a way that it was singularly oriented. It wasn't divided between its parts in some way. And like how would I approach each like what time do I go to bed? What am I going to eat for the next meal? How do I behave with this or that person? How do I do my job? I guess the question that I'm left with from this text is, what is the orientation of my soul? And I don't think I have a life lesson per se, but more of a question. And the question is, in each action, does this orient my soul towards something beyond beyond mere appetite or mere physical things, or is this action oriented towards something transcendent? And so I know that's a bit abstract.
No, indeed, I can relate to the problem very, very, close at hand. It's right. We live these lives that are super fragmented, where we have a bunch of different things. I mean, just an example from my own life, right? It's like I've got my 40-hour work week job, and then I come home and I've got my reading to do in preparation for these podcasts. I've got prayer time to do. I'm a bit of a Bitcoin enthusiast and crypto speculator, and that takes a lot of time and energy, and causes a lot of stress sometimes too. But it's like we live these really really fragmentary lives, and it would seem that something like, or at least I can see why there's the view that Christianity is a sort of disassociation or a assertion of a disbelief at the fragmentation of life by asserting a transcendent truth to which everything points. I can see how that would be an attractive explanation of what's going on in Christianity, because it, has a more or less a pretty robust theology of menial labor and whatever, the daily grind, so to speak. And I think that is entirely lacking in Plato. And I think that your question is the oriented soul in the Platonic sense possible? I think it's a good one, and I don't know that I can answer in the affirmative. I don't know that I can answer in the negative either, but I think the fact that it's an open question is pretty significant.
Yeah, and I think in an additional sense, is a secularly oriented life possible? And a life without theology that is yet oriented towards something transcendent. And I think that's something I struggle with continually, not myself being religious, is what then do I orient my life towards, other than a God, or maybe even the ultimate form of good, if it's possible to do so.
Yeah. I completely agree with everything you guys said, and just my contributions just adding to that. I kind of think rereading the Republic, I just remind myself why I fell in love with philosophy, with capital P. It was a calling to a higher form of life, a call to contemplate the highest good, and then reorient my soul in accordance with that. And sometimes my enthusiasm has kind of waned. Sometimes, I experience a lot of disappointment and frankly kind of absurdity in my life. It almost makes me feel like, a Sartrean existentialist, the just feeling like life is this brute, meaningless exercise. But I reorient myself. My enthusiasm is like, there are many times when I kind of easily, within my sense of, despair and, alienation, become, a hard-nosed atheist or just give it into sort of the nihilistic void in my heart. But I didn't, and I think that's just having that fidelity, towards that to the idea of the good, whether consciously or unconsciously. I think just looking back, I think it's just been this lighthouse for me, within the course of my entire life. It's given my life and all its joys and sorrows a sense of intelligibility. And I think the best we can do, whatever that ideal is, whether it's God or idea of good or whatnot, it has to make sense of our lives. It can't just make sense of the joyful moment. It has to make sense of the entire symphony. And I think reading the texts that orient our soul and help us remember our calling, I think, are essential. I think we need to always keep faith in whatever, in the idea of the good.
That was beautifully put.
I agree. Well, for me, kind of a similar lesson to you, Nathan. I definitely, when I first encountered philosophy, viewed it as a call, as a calling, something divine, something from on high. Something compelled me to study this stuff. And I think for a variety of reasons, I allowed myself at certain points in my philosophical education to be, very much like some of the characters in the dialogue, right? I mean, I think part of it is just the process by which one enters into philosophy, which I believe that the narrative arc of the Republic tells very clearly. I think more than any of the other phases of the descent, I get stuck with Thrasymachus pretty often, or did, trying to win arguments, being a sophist. But more recently, it's kind of been getting lost in the details. I've said recently to in a conversation that I'm sort of I'm a cursed dogmatist, because I'm cursed with philosophy, and yet all I want are sound dogmas and doctrines that I can attend to, right? But I've got this urge and this questioning inside of me to undermine everything that both I and anybody else believe to be dogmatically assertable, right? There's this very, very visceral confrontation of orthodoxy and heterodoxy in my person. And I think more than anything else, I think the moral lesson that I need to take away from the Republic is that I need to be a little bit more gracious and merciful with myself, because I can kind of beat myself up over this conflict. And I think sometimes I forget that at the end of the day, philosophy, contemplation, even this program of reading and podcasting with you, Max, is about something transcendent, regardless of whether or not I have an explanation for what it is or why. But that insofar as we've set ourselves to this task, there's something of a divine spark that's guiding us on our way. And I think I need to be just more receptive to the existence of a transcendent reality that I am incapable of actually understanding, which is something I talk about a lot, but something I do very little of.
Yeah. Or I think we have glimpses of it, but never full understanding.
Indeed.
Yes.
I think that was a beautiful summation of why we're doing this.
I didn't know I was the good summation guy now.
Well, hey, with that, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. It really actually was quite helpful to have you on this podcast. I think we actually, even though it was sort of like one of the Socratic dialogues where we ended with a bit of confusion, I think I actually have a bit more of I'll say that I was just glad to have you as a conversation partner here. And I think that Max and I would have actually maybe struggled to get through this one without some help. So thank you.
I second that completely. Thank you
I'm
so
much obliged. I'm glad that you came with a deeper understanding instead of the aporia at the end.
Well, I think that's in keeping with good Platonic dialogue, indeed.
Great.
Awesome. Well, hey, this is Doyle Baxter. Thanks again for anybody who joined. Max, Doyle, and Nathan talking about Plato's Republic, books 6 through 10. Everybody have a good night. Cheers.
Cheers.